Thank you all for joining us. There we go. Now I can hear it. Thank you all for joining us for today's session, the Exploring the Microeconomic Effects of a Basic Income. I'm Larry Cohen. I'm the Program Development Director of Humanity Forward Foundation. And a little bit about the foundation, that we're working on elevating voices in this community here. And we're trying to make sure that the policies around cash are both seen as nonpartisan and bipartisan issues. I'd love to just go right into it and introduce you to our today's speakers and give you their quick bios, and then we can jump right into it. Scott Santens here from Humanity Forward. Scott has been acknowledged by Andrew Yang as one of those who has helped shape his thinking. Scott has lived with a crowdfunded basic income since 2016 and has been researching and advocating for universal basic income around the world since 2013. He is the author of Let There Be Money. Make sure to pick up a copy when you get the chance on the table over there. And is currently senior advisor to Humanity Forward while also serving on the board of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, and as also the editor of Basic Income Today, a daily UBI news hub. His home is in Washington, D.C., where he just moved from New Orleans with his wife, Katie. Max Ghenis is the founder and president of the UBI Center, a think tank researching basic income policies, and the co-founder and CEO of Policy Engine, a nonprofit that builds open source software to compute the impacts of public policy. He holds a BA in operations research from UC Berkeley and an MS in development economics from MIT. And Joshua Zane Miller is a matriculating freshman at the University of Chicago, interested in mathematics and monetary economics. He is a research assistant at the UBI Center, and he hosts the Think Critical podcast and runs a blog called In the Aggregate. Thank you all for being here today. Just wanted to jump right into the presentations. We'll start with Joshua, and we'll go to Max, and then we'll have a chat with Scott. And feel free to prepare your questions as we go through. I have a few. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions as well, and we'll have a great conversation. So Joshua, take it away.
All right. I get to go first as the least impressive person on the stage. So my presentation today is about simulating the labor supply effects of universal basic income. Because the labor supply effects of universal basic income are largely what drive its viability from an economist perspective, as viability as a policy, its impact on GDP, inflation, and things like that. So without further ado, next slide. So I'm going to go over some concepts in labor supply responses and how universal basic income is going to affect them. And then we're going to take the blank slate UBI policy that my colleague Nikhil presented earlier in this conference. And we're going to use that to show how it would affect, this UBI would affect different households and their labor supply responses. And then we're going to look at the aggregate responses of households and their labor supply under that same policy. Next slide. So here's some concepts in labor supply responses. Largely, next slide, the labor supply responses of any individual is driven by two main effects, the income and the substitution effects. The income effect, essentially, if you keep your income stable, and say you receive more income, you're actually able to consume more based on your, consume the same amount as you would have based on this new income. You actually have to work less. So effectively, what the income effect says is that if I'm receiving either a higher wage or I'm actually receiving more money exogenously from the outside, I don't have to work as much because I can still maintain my lifestyle as I was. So basically, you're subsidizing, leisure by keeping consumption stable. On the other hand, the opposite effect is the substitution effect, which basically says that the substitution effect is when you are making more or less money based on the marginal wage rate, which is the inverse of your marginal tax rate. It's how much of each dollar you're making, per unit of labor time that you're actually keeping. When you're receiving more money, more money in the margin, you actually have an incentive to work more or less. So if your marginal taxes increase, you have an incentive to work less. Marginal taxes decrease. Incentive to work more, and these go opposite each other because one is about keeping consumption stable, one is about keeping consumption moving upwards. We're going to consume more. Next slide. So how does UBI affect this? UBI affects this mostly by increasing your net income and or decreasing your net income and changing your marginal tax rates. So if you're on the lower earnings, lower on the earnings scale, and you get UBI versus the new tax as a fund UBI. You're actually going to be, in this case, you're going to be getting more income in total because the UBI will outweigh your previous tax increase. Whereas if you're making more money, you're actually going to get less, post the policy because you're paying more in taxes you're getting back in UBI. So that's going to be affecting your income effect. And then as the marginal tax rates to affect your substitution effect, basically UBI, obviously to have a UBI, you must raise some taxes. When we're raising taxes, you're going to face a higher marginal tax rate. Whereas a UBI, which involves abolishing certain programs, such as means-tested programs, is actually going to lower your marginal tax rate because means-tested programs actually create marginal taxes that actually create big disincentives to work. And I'm going to go into that in the intersections of that later. Next slide. So a big concept to keep in mind is that the substitution effect outweighs the income effect by about 5 times. What this means is that while people have an incentive to keep their consumption stable, they vastly prefer to increase their consumption. It also means that when you raise taxes, even though there should be an incentive to make more money to keep like how much you're consuming stable, because you're making so much less money because your taxes went up per additional hour worked, you're actually going to have a disincentive to work more. So it's important to keep in mind that although in a perfect world those would be equal and they would sort of countervail each other, in reality, because of the power of the substitution effect, a lot of times tax increases are disproportionate labor supply responses. Next slide. So we're going to look at the blank slate EBI. This is a refresher for what that is. That's abolishing the federal income and payroll taxes, putting in a 50% flat tax on all income, then abolishing a bunch of means-tested programming like WIC, SNAP, TAMF, and SSI, and also the housing subsidies. What this will do is it's going to create a UBI, obviously funded by that, for all Americans, different ages. And then it's going to reduce poverty by 75%, inequality by 24%, and it's also going to make 60% of Americans better off. So it's a very successful policy. We'll get into a little bit of the nuances of the policy later, but it's a good way to look at what UBI would do to labor supply responses. Next slide. So how would this affect the labor supply responses? Next slide. Well, when thinking about marginal taxes and income, how it's going to affecting, and UBI will affect those, obviously, how that's going to affect the labor supply. When you have your net income go up and your marginal taxes go up, essentially what that means is that you have an incentive not to work as much because you're basically replacing some of your the work you'd be doing to fund your consumption with just additional income. But also, each additional hour you work isn't worth as much because of the higher marginal taxes. So it's just going to reduce your labor supply unambiguously. The opposite of that, obviously, when you're having less income than before and you're making more per hour than before, that's going to create a unambiguous incentive to work more. The other two cases, when they're inverse, it really depends on how big the change in income and in taxes is, and also that elasticity, as I mentioned before, that's going to affect it. It's going to be kind of ambiguous. We don't know which direction labor supply will move in those two corner cases where they're countervailing changes, one marginal tax up and income down, or vice versa. So it's important to look at each of those cases sort of individually. They're a little bit harder to gauge, and a lot of them are common cases. Next slide. So to sort of illustrate like what these cases are, we have 4 examples. Some of them are kind of extreme, but to help give you a good picture of what the sort of scenarios involved in these labor supply is. So a single person, let's say a student making $10,000 or earning $10,000 a year, they're going to be facing a higher net income because of UBI, because the UBI is going to be enormous. It's going to fund them a lot of money every year, but also this flat tax of 50% is going to increase their marginal taxes because they were paying very little marginal taxes before. If you instead you have a couple that's making $30,000 a year, that's a poor couple, and they have 2 children, they're receiving a lot in means-tested benefits, but those are actually reducing their incentive to work, and they aren't receiving a lot as much as they could be if they met all the requirements of the benefits. They're probably facing a lot of phase-outs and cliffs. So the UBI would increase their income, and also it would decrease their disincentive to work because it would actually make them earn a little bit more each hour because they don't have to miss out as much on these means-tested programs that are being abolished. On the other hand, the opposite of that, if you say you have a person who's making a lot of money each year but is single, so I call this the rich bachelor or bachelorette, single $100,000 a year, you're going to be paying a lot more in taxes, and you're not going to be receiving that much in UBI to make up for it. So you're facing a higher marginal tax rate and lower income. So the question is whether or not that decrease in income is enough to incentivize you to work enough to make up for it, or whether you're just making so much less each hour that you're going to reduce your labor supply effect. The last case is this corner case, but it's also a big intersection. We'll get into it more later. This corner case is basically if you're, say, a single parent with a child who's disabled, so basically you're receiving most of the possible different means-tested programs making $25,000 a year, sorry, that means you're receiving SSI, you're receiving a lot of the housing subsidies, TANF, WIC, SNAP. That means that maybe you're receiving so much in child, in these, for your child and for yourself, these means-tested benefits, that you're actually going to be reducing your income so much that it will affect how much you work. In addition to that, you actually are, since you're losing out on these disincentives of work because of these marginal programs, you're actually going to face lower marginal taxes. So that's a decrease in income and then marginal tax. And that will unambiguously, as I said, make you want to work more. Next slide. So that first example, the single person 10,000, we see that that person effectively doubles their income, plus 82% to their net income, but it also raises their taxes by 10%. And that creates, and the substitution effect is so great, that creates a pretty large substitution effect in addition to a pretty large income effect. So this person, let's say that they're a student, they'll be working about 10% less than before, because even though they're making so much more money, they also are just making so much less an hour that they don't want to work as much for both reasons. Next slide. A couple who's making $30,000 a year, instead, that person will, they'll be making about 40%, the family will be making about 40% more than before. So they'll be disincentivized from working as much as they did. However, because we're getting rid of these programs that create disincentives to work, they're actually going to be working a little bit more because of the substitution effect. And substitution effect is so great that even the small, 2% change in marginal taxes is enough to almost completely countervail the income effect. So basically, we have a non-existent labor supply change. That means that, that's what we kind of want. We kind of want these things to stay the same or to, improve labor supply, if anything. But that's a pretty good sign for how these programs will affect poorer families. Next slide. Then a single person making $100,000 a year, as I said, they're making way less money because of this increase in taxes, and they're paying more in taxes. Unambiguously, in this case, they'll be making much less. They'll be working much less because the income effect, their incentive to work as much to recoup their losses, just isn't that high because the income effect is very much weak in comparison to the substitution effect, as I'll show further and further. Next slide. In this last case, this case is pretty interesting because this person is making a little bit less than before, only by about $3,000. However, they are losing out on this massive disincentive to work because things like SSI have massive phase outs, and things like WIC and SNAP, they have these phase ins and they have these cliffs. And we want to make sure that we can get rid of those using a UBI because this creates this huge disincentive to work. And you'll see that this person will be working 120% more. There's two things to say about this. One is that, as I mentioned, intersections, one of the reasons why we had the welfare queen myth in America is because basically we created a system of programs that would basically make it irrational for any person receiving a large amount of these programs to ever work because they lose out so much income. Instead of a UBI, they get the choice of working or not working in addition to receiving more income anyways. Because if you look at that 93% marginal tax rate, that means that they're making $10 an hour, they'd be receiving 70 cents an hour instead of based on their what they'd be receiving if they weren't working, which is ridiculous. I mean, who would work for 70 cents an hour? Nobody would, which is why we've had these labor issues in America. And by getting rid of that as much as possible, we're improving their ability to work and making it more rational work. However, that increase in labor supply, maybe that's bad because, as I said, this is a person with a disabled child. Maybe if they can't afford childcare, we don't want them to work as much because they have to stay home to take care of their child. So in this case, they might be losing out. It's hard to quantify that. That's why it's important to have narrative stuff in addition to this kind of research, or to look at it more specifically with tighter data sets. Next slide. So we want to look at the aggregate effects of UBI, this blank slate UBI on labor supply. Next slide. So this is what we call a static model. So basically, we're not looking at the macroeconomic effects in this model like before the fact. So basically, when this model is created, it's a revenue neutral model. We're raising as much as we're giving out. However, when we take into account the labor supply effects, because people are working less overall under this model, there's less employment income in the government tax. It means we're losing about $860 billion of revenue. And that losing out on that, that's it's important because not only is the government losing out on that revenue, and we might have problems of budget neutrality, but also that whole decrease in labor supply actually creates effects on GDP and on inflation. Last year, I presented a paper at the same conference, which went over basically that the GDP effect of UBI would affect how much inflation would be created by UBI. And ideally, if the GDP effect is zero or positive, you wouldn't get any inflation from it, at least in my belief. However, if you are having this huge labor supply decrease, that's going to reduce the growth effect of UBI. It's going to make it perhaps growth negative, which is something we don't want. A big driver of this, of course, is this whole substitution effect. The fact that UBI might, because of the taxes especially, might make it so disincentivized to work extra, because you're making so much less an hour because of the tax. It's all substitution effect, very little income effect, as I pointed out multiple times. So what that means is that we need to rerun our model, perhaps, and try and optimize the tax rates in our model to get rid of this labor supply effect. Because at the end of the day, we're doing UBI to help reduce poverty, to help make the economy grow, but most importantly, to help people improve their lives. And if the economy shrinks so much that the effect of UBI becomes negative because of the tax increases, then we're not doing our jobs correctly. So it's important when we're constructing this policy to take into account the growth and labor effects of UBI and the labor, the growth effects that are really driven by labor effects, or else we were going to deal with a situation where, yeah, we're giving out money, but the detrimental effect of the new taxation will be enough to perhaps make it really not worth it and not really improve as many lives as we'd like to. And then that's it.
Cool. Thank you, Joshua. There's a lot to take in, so I hope you all took notes. I just wanted to, because I jumped ahead a little bit, but I want to make sure that we recognize that this session and all these sessions have been in due part to the generous support of our sponsors for this conference. So that would be the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, Aid Kit, and Steady. So we'd like to thank them for that. And I know it's a little late, but that this session is being recorded, so you're all a part of this now. So please be aware that that's being recorded and that it'll be available on Crowdcast at the end of the session. With that, I'd love to give Max the mic.
Great. Thank you. So my name is Max Ghenis. I am the co-founder and CEO of Policy Engine. We build software to develop, to compute the impact of public policy. Can you guys hear my mic? Okay, cool. And I'm also a visiting scholar at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. I'm presenting a paper that I wrote for them 2 weeks ago or so on Cambridge, Massachusetts, the proposed cash assistance program that came out in April. Next slide. So in April, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the mayor actually proposed a new cash assistance program that I'll describe. I'll also show some of the impacts on poverty and the budget that look at if this program were expanded to Massachusetts, that's sort of just for data reasons, a limitation. But using Policy Engine software, we can show those kinds of impacts. And also how the proposal would affect welfare cliffs. So my colleague Joshua just talked a lot about marginal tax rates. There are some cases where if benefit programs phase out immediately instead of gradually, you can't really compute marginal tax rates in the way you normally would. So this ends up being a pretty important complementary metric for assessing the labor supply effects of any policy that in the tax benefit system. And I'll close by just benchmarking it against universal child allowance. So finding that it doesn't quite reduce poverty as much as this targeted program does, but it's a way to get around these kinds of cliffs created in Cambridge. Next slide. So next slide again. What we're looking at here is, Cambridge Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui, she proposed a program that really resembles a pilot that Cambridge started last year called RISE. And this gives $500 per month for 18 months to families with dependents who have income below 200% of the poverty line. So importantly, there's no phase out. If you earn $1 above 200%, you get $0. If you have $1, or I guess exactly, then you get the full, effectively $9,000 payment spread over 18 months. Next slide. So we find this would really reduce poverty dramatically. If it were expanded across Massachusetts, you're looking at 15% poverty reduction, 42% child poverty, and essentially it eradicates deep child poverty. So that's the set of people who are below half the poverty line of children. And it would cost $1.2 billion over 1 year, or if you're thinking of it as sort of an 18-month program, that's $1.8 billion. Next slide. Now, the critical part that we really sought to answer in this question, in this paper, was what happens to your work incentives? And to answer that question, you really have to start with what do Massachusetts residents face today in terms of income and substitution effects. So you've got your federal income tax on the federal side, a lot of federal benefit programs as well. So free and reduced price school meals, broadband subsidies, housing subsidies. A lot of these are sort of either fully federal or federal, state, local partnerships. And then you look at the Massachusetts system, adding on top of that, you have a state income tax. You have a program called the COVID emergency supplements. Many states have implemented this for SNAP. Some of them have now expired. But in Massachusetts, they still have this program where if you qualify for SNAP at all, you're going to get the maximum allotment for your household size. So this creates actually a very significant cliff, which we'll show in a minute. And there's also programs like the SSI state supplement, supplemental security income, TANF is a local program. So you really need to understand, especially for these welfare cliffs analyses, what their full tax benefit system looks like today. And we've been able to model that with our software. Next slide. So this is just what it looks like for a family of 4 today. So family with 2 children in Massachusetts. On the x-axis, you have the employment income. So how much do they earn? And on the y-axis is the amount of net income after taxes and benefits are computed. So you can kind of see there's a pretty steep curve at the bottom. So those are relatively low marginal tax rates. It starts to get a little bit higher marginal tax rates as the curve bends a bit more. And then you've got this big cliff. So once you hit $55,000 of earnings, you lose your entire SNAP allotment. And this is due to the SNAP emergency allotment program active in Massachusetts. And you also lose some programs that are conditional on SNAP receipt. So SNAP, once you have it, you automatically get free school meals, for example, and a few other programs. So in total, you lose about $10,000 from that dollar you earn above 200% of the poverty line. And another way, that's really too bad, it's a little bit too light gray to show up here, but imagine that there's a gray zone between 55,500, which is where that's the 200% of the poverty line, and 69,500. That's the zone where it really doesn't make sense for you to earn. So we call this an earnings dead zone. And that's where, if you look sort of the top of that peak right before you lose SNAP, that's about $60,000 in net income. To get back to that point, you have to earn another $14,000. So this is kind of not captured by marginal tax rates, but clearly it's going to, people are going to respond as we all would and avoid earning in that zone. Next slide. So now you stack on top of this, the cash assistance program, it phases out, or it has a cliff at exactly the same point, right? So 200% of the poverty line, you lose your SNAP emergency allotment, you lose anything dependent on SNAP, and you lose your eligibility for this $9,000 payment through the Cambridge Cash Assistance Program. So now, instead of losing $10,400, you're losing $19,400 for that extra dollar you earn. And the earnings dead zone grows by about a factor of 2. So instead of $14,000, you're now wanting to avoid earning between $55,000 and $81,000. That's $26,000 earnings range that you kind of want to avoid. So yeah, this is a pretty big distortion in the labor market is what an economist would say. Next slide. So another alternative to this is something that does not have this substitution effect. It doesn't have cliffs. It doesn't have a phase out. You can imagine something that's achieving the same goal, which really, because this program's geared toward poverty reduction, child poverty especially, it's only households with child dependence, you could think about child allowance as an alternative. And this chart kind of looks at the comparison of that. So with that $1.2 billion it costs to fund that, the program, the Cambridge Cash Assistance Program, if expanded across Massachusetts, you could fund a $75 per month child allowance. And that's that vertical line in the Cambridge Cash graph here. So that's that 1.2 billion. And you can kind of see the poverty reduction is on the y-axis. It's a much smaller anti-poverty impact, which we expect. We're not targeting that money at low-income people anymore. So it's about a 2% poverty reduction compared to about 15%. At the same time, once you start to increase that child allowance, you're eventually going to get to the same poverty reduction without the distortions, but you need to spend about 2.5 times as much. So you've got to spend about $3 billion to achieve the same poverty reduction. So you kind of, this an interior solution, an interior advantage from having the means testing if you totally disregard the work incentive issue. Next slide. So just to wrap up, essentially, I want to communicate this cash assistance program is extremely effective at cutting poverty, and a large part of that is because, unlike a lot of programs today, there's no phase-in, so it has a huge impact on deep poverty as well, and it's going to be fairly efficient because it's just giving people money. At the same time, these earnings dead zones are really we haven't seen empirical research on this question, so we really don't know how distortionary it is, but I think it's plausible that it's at least as distortionary as the kind of marginal tax rates that have been well studied that Joshua covered. So I think we need to just consider these as we're designing our policies, not just in isolation, but also how does it interact with the rest of the tax benefit system that people engage with today. And an alternative, a way to avoid elongating any of these earnings dead zones is to not have any marginal tax rate at all in the benefit system. And one way to do that is a child allowance. Requires raising more revenue to have the same kind of anti-poverty impacts, but it does avoid these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Max, for that very good breakdown. And I could see the gray line, so I could see what you were talking about. So hopefully the rest of the audience did as well. Before I have Scott take it away, I just wanted to add a little bit about Humanity Forward, as I'm part of Humanity Forward Foundation, and Humanity Forward and Humanity Forward Foundation are sibling organizations that are working together. And I just wanted to say with Humanity Forward that they're working to take the work that's being done here in this room and across the country, the community energy around pilots and research and grassroots activism, and working to translate that translate it to policymakers and legislators to create real and permanent change. So with that, I would love to have Scott go right ahead.
Thanks, Larry. I'm just going to be sitting down. That's okay.
Perfect.
And I also I apologize in advance. Kind of running in the red today, and it's the Pulp Fiction. Like I'm a race car in the red, and I say that as a white dude. Like I can't even imagine what the people, especially women, are feeling at this moment today. And I also like to preface what I'm about to say with the admission that I am not an economist. I would also like to say that I am not an astrologist. And along those lines, like I just haven't studied astrology enough to tell all of you what of one personality type you all are and exactly what's going to happen to you today based on where the planets and stars were when you were born. And if I have offended some people who believe in astrology out there, I'm sorry. What you believe in is a pseudoscience that doesn't reflect reality. And if I've offended some economists out there just now by suggesting that economics is a pseudoscience built on mythologies, then I also apologize to you. If I've offended you, here's something that offends me. Building a science on top of myths. Here's a myth that economics is built on top of. The myth that every human is selfish. That is a myth. Humanity is where we are today because we are a collaborative species. It's amazing where we are today because of our inherent social nature and desire to work together. So to assume that we are all selfish is just bullshit. Here's another thing. Another thing that isn't real. Money isn't real. We invented money as a species, just like we invented inches and points. There is no limit to the amount of money that we have to do stuff with. What matters is human life, human rights, and resources. What matters is what can we do with the resources we have, the technology we have, the knowledge that we've collectively created to actually utilize resources to the best effect. So that's what I want people to walk away with today too, is that, like, money isn't real. Now there's a South Park episode that I really love that kind of makes fun of this, and I think reveals a good truth too. It's the Pinewood Derby episode of South Park. For those who are unfamiliar with this episode, an alien is escaping like the space cops and lands in the South Park, and he's got a bunch of space bucks in his UFO, and the town ends up using the space bucks. And it's funny, like, Earth basically suddenly gets richer because they've got all these space bucks. And it's like, the joke is Mexico suddenly feels, richer, so they build a bunch of like water parks and hospitals. They just suddenly created all these things because they got more space bucks. And so that's really kind of how I look at the economy too, in general, in money in general. Whenever someone says something like, do we have enough money to pay for basic income? Do we have enough money to end poverty? And the question is really, do we have enough space bucks? Like, it doesn't really exist. It's a bad question. The question is, do we have enough resources for everyone to have enough to meet their basic needs? Do we have enough food? Do we have enough housing? Do we have enough clothing? Do we have enough electricity? Like, these are the kinds of things that we need to be asking. And of course, the answer is yes. Of course. Of course we have enough. What we don't have enough of is the collective willpower to do it. And so that's what when I think of macroeconomics, I also just kind of want to zoom out and really look at the big picture. And I kind of look at it from this perspective of like a Martian, and how like humans are running around deciding that other humans don't deserve enough food. Why? And this belief that you can only earn income if you prove yourself having done enough work to earn what you need to live. Which is funny, like, we're the only species on Earth that has to pay to live, because we invented money. And we decided that only some people deserve money and other people don't, unless. And I think that unless is it's a question that we should question that, unless. It's a matter of human rights that people have enough to live. If you're going to lock up all the resources and require keys called money in order to access it. So with that said, too, I want to just talk for just a bit about what we just did during the pandemic. It was amazing to watch where things went south very quickly, and the government magically came up with trillions of dollars and just gave it to us. What did we use it for? Well, we used it for our basic needs. Suddenly we had miles-long lines for food banks, and all the grocery stores were full. They still had food. So we got money to buy stuff from the stores. We got money to actually pay the rent. We got money to be more in control of our own lives. And, we didn't tax first in order to do it. We didn't borrow first in order to do it. We just did it. It was amazing to even watch the stimulus check, the bills be signed. And, we just did it. And that's really what we're facing. People will argue, it caused so much inflation. Oh my gosh, can't do this. It caused inflation. And, first of all, the economists out there are debating how much of inflation it was responsible for. And, but again, I want to focus back on resources, because that's really what inflation is about. It's about the imbalance between supply and demand, that if supply falls below demand, then they're going to have shortages, prices are going to rise, and that's how the signaling system works. So then people can argue, no, people have too much money. We need to figure out a way to reduce the amount of spending people are doing. It's a problem. A real problem that people have money to spend. So we need to figure that out. But if you think about it in terms of resources, then it just becomes more clear what the problem is. If we're in a situation, we're inside of a pandemic. Over 1 million Americans are dead, and the live ones who survived are complaining about inflation. Oil prices are way up. Putin just invaded Ukraine. And so, of course, an impact of that is what the rest of the world reacted to that. We said, well, we're not going to buy your oil anymore. And Ukraine was going to sell oil. They're also making a bunch of grain. Again, we are a global economy. We're a collaborative global species. And there's inflation all over the world because of the impacts of a pandemic and a war on our resource allocation ability to meet demand with supply. So keeping it real as far as what we can actually do, I think, is vitally important, and keeping it in terms of money not being real. Of course, we can just do money. The question is, how do we organize society so that we all have enough food and basic needs met, dignity, security, stability, that we recognize each other's right to exist, and then we build our economy around that. How crazy is it that we have an economy built on the assumption that unpaid work doesn't count as work, that care labor doesn't count, unless two care workers pay each other to watch their kids or their family members, then that counts to the economy. That increases GDP. So, of course, we need to recognize unpaid work, volunteer work. We need to recognize everything that we can accomplish and want to accomplish as work. We need to stop prohibiting people from doing what they want to do. We need to create a system that actually doesn't involve poverty wages and create a situation where people will actually work for pennies, because pennies is better than nothing. So, yeah, like the big question is, do we have the willpower to actually recognize our inherent dignity and rights as members of the same species? We're all in this together. We have division of labor where everything that we have is created because of each other. And all of it is possible because of all of our ancestors whose shoulders we exist on top of, whose body of knowledge we utilize today. And yeah, where do we go from here? How do we turn things around? I just firmly believe that basic income is just absolutely vital to turning our species around and actually achieving everything that we have the potential to achieve, that we are actively preventing ourselves from achieving as long as we withhold access to basic resources from each other. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. That makes my questions irrelevant. So let me see if I can pivot here. I'm curious about, for Max and Joshua, when you point out these welfare cliffs to those who are proposing it or pitching it, what is their response? Do they see it and do they want to just say it's not going to happen that way? Or do they say that's the price we're going to pay for this proposal? This is the best we can do. This is what our constituency says. Like, I'm curious, what is that back and forth when you point out with your models what can be done? And then for Scott, what is your experience taking that kind of a message to folks who are, be seen as economists and the organizers of the economy, and try to bring that kind of passion and that focus of a message into folks who may not see the world in sort of the abstract and sort of the needs of the people, but more of like ones and zeros, and there's a yes and a no, and there's a binary, action and opposite reaction, and that's why we're planning it as such. So, whoever wants to jump in. Joshua, go ahead.
So I'm going to share a little story about me and Max. We're working last night in the presentation, and I was looking at one of the charts of these welfare cliffs, and I said to myself, and I said to everybody at the table, did the people who designed this actually look at this chart or like design one of these charts when they wrote the policy? And the incredible thing is, the simple answer is no, they don't. A lot of times when these policies are passed and these policies are created, the people who are writing them up don't stop to think about the incentives created by said policies. And a lot of times there's just this general lack of like acknowledgement that there's incentives at play whenever you pass a policy related to taxes or benefits. Because people either always want to pretend that any additional dollar is going to disincentivize work. That's not always true. They don't acknowledge that when they do pass these additional programs, the people are going to start facing these new trade-offs. Like, one of the hard things to really picture is that for a large amount of Americans, there is this huge disincentive to work, or at the end of the day, people are pretty rational about like if they're going to be making less money working than they will at home. They're going to do that, and why wouldn't they? I don't blame them at all. There's nothing morally wrong about that. So the important thing is to create a system that allows people to work and to also receive benefits, because a lot of time we have these, you bring up these policies to policymakers or to average people, and they don't really understand that, like, yes, for many Americans, if you go and you work instead of receiving all these benefits, which you will at this certain income level, you're actually making only 70 cents an hour out of your $10, so, which is a ridiculous amount. Like, I mean, really, who here, when you went to work, if you're making 7% of your actual wage, nobody would do that, and that, and that's, nobody expects you to do that, which is why it's important to continually point these out, because these are just not thought about much at all by a lot of policymakers and by average people.
I just want to add on to that too, just because it's directly related. It's funny to see how there's the belief out there, there's a real concern that if we tax the rich too much, that they'll start working less. And that concern is like with oh, we can't go from like 40 to 50% tax rate. We'll work less. And yet, as Josh was describing too, it's like we look at someone facing a 95% tax rate or even over 100%, and we say, you're lazy, you get to work. And it's just silly. Like, why is it that we apply one thing to the rich and one thing to the poor and treat them so differently when it comes to marginal tax rates?
I got another great example, if I can sort of briefly share. I'm 17, right? So I used to receive, or I guess I still do, I sort of receive allowance from my parents. And I always had to point out to them, like, based on the allowance you give me for not working, I don't have an incentive to like get a job. And I'm like, I feel like you need to, and I had to like, I made my dad sit in the audience. I made an MTR chart to try to explain to him what the amount should be.
No.
But what Scott pointed out is true. Rich people in America do not pay as much in marginal taxes. They pay more in absolute taxes, but do not pay as much in marginal taxes for the poor people, which is, I mean, like, even if like, for example, the goal really should be to get even marginal taxes. So that means that you have the incentive to basically just make money and to not like face a huge trade-off for making additional money, or making, when you're making less, even you should be paying a little, more marginal taxes, but not these huge cliffs. These huge cliffs basically lock people into these certain zones of income, as Max pointed out in his presentation. Like, if you're making in that income dead zone, why would you look for the better job, try and get out of your situation, or why would you take that second job, go from part-time to full-time, and at the end of the day, an economy that's based around people who participating in a living, breathing, working-based economy, that's what we want. We're not eliminating human work at any time in the future. Especially we've seen in the pandemic, service workers are essential. So let's make it so that we have an economy where service workers aren't ignored, and to be a service worker isn't to take this job that puts you in this dead zone, but there's to be a dignified position where you're not actually losing out on any income by doing so.
Also, just in defense of his allowance.
Dad, are you listening? Okay.
The problem isn't the existence of the allowance. The problem is pulling away the allowance with earned income. So that's an argument for permanent allowance.
There we go.
Yeah.
Also,
We're doing what we can, Joshua. We're trying to save it here in real time.
I'll also just defend existing policymakers. I think it is hard to understand this stuff. There aren't really tools, we're trying to fix this, but there aren't great tools for understanding what the impact even of the existing program are. A lot of people don't see these cliffs and the marginal tax rate when you consider federal income tax, state income tax, all the benefit programs you can have. Some programs are local. They just occur, New York City has an EITC, right? So figuring out how all of these interact is a difficult problem that policymakers are not equipped to handle. So I think it's pretty natural that you would fall back on things that probably before some of us in the audience were exposed to UBI or basic income in general are natural heuristics for humans to think. Focus your assistance on the people who need it, right? I mean, it's in the Bible, right? From, I don't know, you guys know the quotes. To the
Whatever
people who
that
need it.
quote
Yeah,
said.
exactly.
There's a Marx quote which I'm not remembering.
Maybe it's Marx. Marx is the Bible. But
Potato, potato.
yeah, or give things that people need instead of money. I think these are natural human instincts that they fall back on, that they're people who are advocating for them to make policy changes also advocate for them. And also, if you have a guaranteed income pilot that was means tested in a specific way, which I think can make a lot of sense from a donor's perspective, but it doesn't always make sense to do that direct translation from what makes sense from donors to what makes sense for public policy. So I am actually optimistic that when policymakers and the public and think tanks and advocacy groups all see the kind of data that we're presenting, it's not just us in this space, there are other great researchers, they'll be able to make better choices.
I'd also just say too, like in defense of economists and existing heuristics.
Almost punch you, man.
First of all, like really kind of a deep understanding of like reality versus modeling requires lived experience. And I would say there's not a lot of economists that really experience the welfare system and the existing safety net. It really takes, in order to, having a sense of empathy and experience to know that these assumptions that we make are false. And also, since we're talking about like marginal tax rates and stuff, I just want to mention that like Max and I had an interaction with someone else on a Twitter summit recently when we were explaining the difference between negative income tax and UBI. And the way I tried to explain it is that negative income tax is a UBI that's been paired with a phase-out tax. So what matters is really the taxation. The taxation is always, pretty much always, going to be part of the UBI conversation. So, when some people, like under the existing status quo and the existing kind of scarcity mentality, are thinking, we have a limited amount of money, how do we best target people at the bottom? And how do we disproportionately help the poor and marginalized so that we best use this like scarce amount of money? And so that's why also I want to break out of that paradigm and think about terms of abundance, where there isn't this limited amount of money to split. What matters is making sure that everyone has that flat rate, that flat amount, and then we can just carve out via taxes what we feel the end distribution should be. So it's not about coming up with money first and thinking about it scarce. It's about starting with the base, deciding that we have rights and dignity and that everyone should have enough, and then deciding, all right, it's unnecessary here, who should tax here, also what's the best way to tax, what are the best things to tax. Like the conversation when you think about like targeting and who to help through the UBI paradigm should be thinking, what is the best way to tax? What should we be taxing for the outcomes that we want to get? And when it comes to like a negative income tax, let's say you have like a 50% tax rate, so that for every dollar earned, you lose 50 cents of your amount that you're getting. That is effectively taxing people with a 50% tax rate at the point when you start taxing it, and then at the point that it ends. So, of course, it makes more sense when you're looking at it from that perspective that a better phase-out tax is applied widely so that you can lower it. You can actually have a much lower phase-out tax rate if you actually spread it out. And so that's really why both of us prefer UBI to NIT, is because we have an understanding of those marginal tax rates and an understanding that it works better to actually have a lower marginal tax rate spread out and just utilize the tax system that already exists in order to reach the distributional outcomes that we want to achieve.
Yeah.
I'd also like to spend some time defending economists. Oh no, the U Chicago kids gonna talk about economics. But I think a lot of us kind of forget how economists are not really what they're portrayed as and what they think is a lot closer to what we're thinking. And shout out to Aleda here, their presentation. They mentioned Milton Friedman, who was a proponent of the NIT, although his NIT actually involved this very, very low and slow phase out. But even people like Milton Friedman, people like Greg Mankiw, they proposed UBI and NIT policy style like that to try and create systems that were so much better in terms of incentives for poor people, but also economists nowadays, we're looking at, but they're looking at, they're looking at paying for things in this manner where they're asking the question, to what degree does the system of, issuing treasury bonds instead of just paying for things with taxes, to what degree are the things that we can do with the monetary and fiscal system gonna be impactful versus the resource distribution, and how are we going to motivate real resources to do things? And a lot of economists have come to the conclusion that when it comes to things that improve economic growth, we can sort of have this gray room to basically do whatever we want with the monetary and fiscal system to cause this. In effect, what we did in 2020 to help keep the economy afloat is when you have that big emergency like COVID, you could sort of do whatever it takes monetarily, fiscally, to make sure the economy doesn't implode. And right now, I think it's important to shift the paradigm of the conversation to thinking we're in a pretty bad spot growth-wise. Why don't we take what we did in 2020 in this huge, this hugely instrumental and impactful situation, and say, why don't we try policies that will both reduce poverty and increase growth, like UBI, properly designed, to spend some time not really worrying so much about the taxes exactly, but maybe going to deficit spending to help fund these sort of programs, to help bring our economy to this new level. Because at the end of the day, when we move to that next level economically, that's when we're going to start to achieve the things we really can and want to achieve as a species. Because we made it to the moon on the back of having an economy that could put a man on the moon. And why don't we go to Mars next, out of the solar system? And the way we have to do that is by going from the ground up and building, anti-poverty, and then, growth and labor measures that will help improve an economy to that level.
Great. Well, I want to give the audience a quick chance for any questions that you might have. And it looks like we have a few questions to start with, which is great.
Yes, from our virtual audience, Alex Howlett asks, why is it bad to decrease labor supply? Are we assuming that people wanting to work more is automatically good?
Yeah, that's great. So a couple things with that. First of all, I want to point out that there are things like a 4-day week that have been shown to actually increase productivity, and that I would argue, especially I recommend people read Bertrand Russell's In Praise of Idleness, and this idea of what's the point of say baking bread if there's no value in eating it. And so, there's certainly value in leisure time. There's certainly value in the consumption of what we all create together. And so, we definitely should make sure that we have enough time to actually enjoy life and enjoy what we're all doing together. And on the other aspect of this too, is it's funny, automation hasn't really been discussed really much at all during this conference, which I think was really interesting. And Gerald Huff spoke of the human labor fallacy, which is that our assumption that what we create requires human labor, which of course is untrue. And I would argue that if there is a task that technology can do that humans don't enjoy doing, then we should absolutely automate that. And we should automate the hell out of all kinds of things. One of the problems we're not automating enough because human labor is so cheap, which again goes to this people don't want to work, when actually the problem is, well, you need to pay more if you want people to work. So you give people basic income, they have the power to refuse work unless the conditions are met. Wages go up, automation can then go up because suddenly it makes more sense to automate because human labor is more expensive. And as long as the UBI is tied to overall productivity, then as we automate more, we're all better off. And that's exactly how it should be. This fear of automation is kind of silly because, we should be extremely happy that a robot can do something that we don't want to do. And so we should actually aim to do more of that. Let's automate as much as we can. Let's enjoy life more.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we should automate as much as possible and not be concerned about progress. But I think it's precisely because there's so much opportunity in the future. There's so many huge problems in the world. Yeah. We're all very lucky to be in this room and not in an extremely low income country starving.
Right.
And there are people who, if we have a stronger economy, we can help the rest of the world more through technological advancement and through just economic growth and having smart foreign aid policy and well-informed donors who can give to where it's most needed. And even in here, we all have problems that we're grappling with. You know, my grandmother passed last year not knowing who I was because of Alzheimer's. My brother has spinal cord injury. I would love for him to walk again. And we need people to work on those problems.
Another thing is when you decrease or increase labor supply, you're thinking about, like, at the end of the day, labor supply is driving the growth of the economy. We want to make sure that we're not, by incentivizing such a reduction that would make it, make people worse off, make the economy worse off. What we want is humans and robots working together, because nothing can really replicate the human mind. And maybe we're going to move to a future where and I think we're going to eventually get to this future where what you see is a human worker using his or her mind or their mind in a manner that is, taking advantage of its creative powers, its powers of, imagination, but also there are still certain jobs that are going to have to be done by humans. In fact, I believe that certain service sector jobs that are kind of require a human touch, those are going to be kept around. What we need is to make sure those jobs are dignified and well paid. And part of the way we do that is by things like UBI actually creating things on the extensive and intensive margin. In fact, one of the things we got to consider is not just like labor hours, but how many people are working. When more people work, wages go up because there's competition for workers. We want a tight labor market where people are really, companies are really after and trying to get people to work for them, giving them benefits and things like that, and creating a society focused where the company has to beg the worker for their time rather than the other way around. Something like we had for a little bit of the time around the pandemic. Another thing to consider, I think, is at the end of the day, sometimes we have this, and this is a paper written by Darren Acemoglu and I can remember the name of the other economist.
Restrepo.
Oh, yeah, Restrepo. They looked at basically what drives automation, and a lot of times it's actually capital taxation incentives. And so the issue is, are we creating a society in which companies are using robots to just lower worker wages without creating an extensive benefit because of wealth inequality or because they're not creating a huge amount of extra output? And so we have to worry about automation, this sort of gray zone where we're allowing automation to just damage workers without providing them a benefit. Now, there's a lot of results that do call this paper into question, and I don't believe it 100%, but it's important to consider that, further looking at that question as well.
Hey, okay, so I like that you brought up time recently. That's a good segue, because I wanted to mention back to the whole resource conversation, boiling it down to resources. I would argue one of our most, or maybe our most scarce and the least automatable and technologically enhanceable resource is time, right? The time we have on this planet to do the things we want to do, right?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I want to nitpick a little bit on the dead zones that you were talking about. I think you're short selling them in the way you described them. I think you're very accurate in saying, like, this is the area, say it's like after this welfare cliff, it takes another 15,000 in earnings to get back to where you were. I don't think that's where the dead zone ends, because if you earn $15,001, then you just work $15,001 harder to get a buck, right? So I'm wondering if you have ways to visualize, or if you've thought of ways to visualize the actual realized disincentive dead zone. Like if I have a welfare cliff at 50K for my family, and I'm trying to think of whether I'm going to take a new job, and it's going to take me $30,000 just to even break even after losing all my benefits, then I need that job to pay me like $70,000 more for me to even start to think about it, because what I'm giving up for that extra buck is $30,000 worth in the time that I'm not spending with my kids. So there's that opportunity cost, So can you speak to that a little bit? How can we make it even more apparent how it's not like a welfare queen trope or whatever of people being lazy? This is the absolute smartest thing you can do in the situation we're putting people in, is to not look for work. It's the financial literacy be damned. This is the right decision to make.
Yeah.
But if you take that job, you're a sucker. I mean, or you're just so you have such high integrity. I interviewed people who someone who lost their food stamps because they worked an extra hour in 1 week, and I asked why, because it was apparent that she knew that was going to happen. She said, it's because I'm a health aid worker and they need me. So we punished her for doing what's right for society. So yeah, back to like, how do we really make that clear in non-wonky terms? Like, this is the real disincentive. Like, you're going to cut someone off at this level, then you're going to make it sure that they're not working unless they're getting another 6 figures, you know?
Well, once he said non-wonky, I feel like I should not be the person. But I mean, this is really a ripe area in economic research. There's a bunch of general equilibrium models that assume that various people in the economy, I think, you know, there's kernels of truth. There's empirical evidence that people really do respond to incentives. And it really comes back to the income and substitution effect Joshua was talking about. Essentially, these models assume that individuals are trying to optimize, maximize the total, I'd say utility. I guess the non-economic term is like, how much is all the well-being in your life? You're trying to maximize the well-being, and you're making choices every day to optimize that. And the way part of your well-being is how much time you spend with your family or just how much leisure you have. And part of it is how much you can consume. So a lot of these models only consider marginal tax rates in that part of the equation. But as you said, if you have a 0% marginal tax rate, you're definitely going to work less because you want to prefer that leisure time. And that's where, you know, income and substitution effects come in. So I think we'll get there in the next couple of years. We're hoping to contribute to that research body, and hopefully someone can make like awesome visualizations or YouTube videos or something from it too.
Here's some non-wonk talk. I would say, like, when people ask me kind of the difference between basic income and welfare, you know, unconditionality versus conditionality, you know, I like to say that basic income is not paying people to do nothing. Basic income is paying people to do anything. And so I think that that kind of gets at the incentive differences between these cliffs when we pull money away versus making sure that what they have is a permanent floor underneath them where they themselves can figure out what makes most sense for them. They're certainly not getting paid to do nothing. That's the existing system of conditionality. Unconditionality means you are free to pursue what you're most interested in.
Before we get all the questions, I know there are several and we only have a few minutes, but I want to make sure we'll get as many questions as we can, and we'll just keep going until I see someone try to pull the mic off. So we'll just keep going.
I just want to pick up on, my question is related to what Scott said on the absurdity of we don't count care work as work unless 2 caregivers are taking care of each other's kids because that increases GDP. I'm part of an initiative called Measuring What Matters, and we're looking at different prosperity metrics because GDP, of course, doesn't measure quality of life.
Yeah.
And so my question is, a big opposition to basic income that we face is the charitable system. The status quo is working and we have the outcomes to prove it. For instance, poverty in Canada is decreasing and that's without a basic income. So what's your response to that?
My response is, I mean, of course, that there are always things to do that are better than the status quo if that's what we decide to do. And I think that, you know, we should question GDP, of course. And if we want better outcomes, part of determining what is a better outcome is measuring things appropriately. And so what we should do is measure stuff like mental health, physical health, well-being, happiness, carbon pollution, like all these things, you know, gun deaths, all this. And then explicitly try to reach better measurements over time. And if we're doing something that isn't achieving those better measurements, then we should question, you know, if those are actually working, and then we should test out things and try new things and eventually just continually go over time to this better world that we're appropriately measuring and appropriately deciding amongst each other as being what we want to go towards, when obviously this existing system is not what most of us want, although it is what some of us want, a very small percentage.
I'll just add, GDP per capita is definitely does not capture everything. I think the childcare is one of the biggest deficiencies, but it correlates pretty darn well with a lot of the other kind of things we care about, imperfectly, but correlates well with life expectancy, with other health outcomes, with technological advancement, various measures of well-being, self-reported included. So I'm interested to hear what kind of progress you make, because I think it would be great to improve upon it, but it's kind of the best of what we have right now, in my opinion.
I like to say, like, GDP is a tool macroeconomists can use to help make sure the economy isn't shrinking, you know, and make sure that we have spending enough monetarily, fiscally, to avoid recessions and stuff like that. What an economist's job should be is to make sure that we're using GDP to avoid, you know, as an indicator of recession and nothing really much more than that. At the end of the day, we want to take away economic problems from your problems, because we can't fix everything by giving you more money, but we can take away the issues which that would cause, poverty would cause, losing your job would cause, from your problems in your relationships and in your life, and then let really the meat of life be about figuring that out. If we get to that state where all that you have to worry about is you and not the economy, then we've really been successful.
One more question from our virtual audience. This is from Alma's to Max and Joshua. Can your model disaggregate labor supply effects for men and women? Are we looking at those differences?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't yet, but so the numbers Joshua cited, substitution effect is that elasticity is 0.25. So essentially every 10% increase in your net marginal wage is going to increase your labor supply 25%, and then the 5 or 0.05. So every 10% increase into your net income is going to reduce your labor supply by 0.5%. Those are based on numbers from the Congressional Budget Office. And they do break it out, and they find that people who are second earners have much higher elasticity, and those. So women in general, especially with children, are more elastic in that way. And we haven't done that yet, but we have the capacity to do it. We'll do it soon.
And that goes into childcare, because when you have a recession, a lot of times, if in a standard household, a woman is forced to move away from her job in order to take care of children because they can't afford childcare anymore. So part of what's important to look at is when you have these big changes in the tax benefit system, are we incentivizing certain people from moving away or back into their jobs? Do we want that? Do we want that to not happen? As I mentioned with the example of the single mother or single father with the disabled child, we have to worry about are we actually incentivizing certain people to work so much that it's not really what we want from this model and from this policy.
This is a question for, I guess, maybe Scott and Max, because I think one of you or both of you brought up the negative income tax versus BI difference, or the GI versus BI difference. And I understand what you were saying about marginal tax rates. I get that. But a lot of people that I know and hear who prefer the GI or the NIT approach, they worry about targeting the right people, the people who need it most. I mean, I hear this sort of thing. And there's one obvious way that a UBI targets those who need it most too. If you give everyone the same amount of money, then that same amount is going to be a bigger proportion of lower incomes than higher incomes. It's mathematically. Do you think that's worth bringing up in this NIT versus BI discussion? Like X dollars is a bigger proportion of a lower income than higher income. So in that sense, it's targeting.
Are you asking like?
Do you think that's a useful thing to bring up in advocating a UBI versus GI on this? I'm just wondering.
I'll just touch on this. Just feel like one example that I immediately think about when it comes to this kind of, let's say, wanting to target a specific group more. First of all, anytime we draw a line we will always have false exclusion errors where we exclude people that we definitely want to include. So again, this is like modeling versus reality, where like you can think that a guaranteed income or negative income tax, any kind of like targeted income is better. You have to acknowledge that non-universality will always exclude people, just like we saw with the child tax credit and stimulus checks, and the fact that child tax credit was through the tax code, the IRS, the people that we really wanted to reach, thanks to finally lifting the phase-in and making sure that everyone could get it. It meant that non-filers didn't get it, and that was still a challenge. Like even though they were qualified for it, it was hard to reach them. So by using like Social Security Administration, so the IRS, then you're able to reach more people. We see this all over the world too, where there's analysis of target programs versus universal programs, where universal programs always include more people and exclude fewer people. So if that's our goal, then we really want to focus on the universality and unconditionality in order to not exclude anyone we want to include, and just really focus on the tax system. That's how we exclude people from it. And so as another example of this, let's say we wanted to do a policy where we provided a larger amount to Black Americans and we smaller amount to white Americans. And so you can think about that policy. Can we ever actually like achieve that? Like it's a huge challenge to try to achieve that, even if you really believe that that's important and that we should recognize, systemic racism and stuff. And there is a way, I think, to achieve that through an indirect mechanism where you would look at, say, a land value tax. So land value tax would impact the white population more than the Black population. Why is that? Well, because of systemic racism, where for the entire time, the white population prevented the Black population from becoming landowners. So if we did something like my land value tax paired with the UBI, we would essentially achieve that outcome that we want. We wouldn't be explicitly doing it. And I think that by pulling away and make sure everyone gets an equal amount and then pulling away in specific ways, we can really come up with some incredible distributional differences than what we're looking at right now that are actually politically achievable, I think.
Also, so 20% of people who are eligible for the earned income tax credit don't get it. I think it's about 30% for SNAP, and it's about 80% for people who are eligible for the Lifeline program, which provides subsidized broadband and phone programs. So those are numbers that I think UBI can very plausibly do better on. Social Security is basically 100% of people who get it, are eligible get it. And that's actually, it is something we plan to put into the policy engine model over time, is these take-up rates and adjusting them or replacing them with programs that have higher take-up, especially among the poorest who are most often neglected.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize universality as being this method of, really recognizing humanity as what we're trying to improve, trying to reward people for. And there's a lot of different forms of systemic problems that have impacted Americans in their wealth and their income over the years. And it's very hard to disaggregate them and to individually remedy them using cash transfers. It's better to basically, every single time you create a new requirement, any new policy rules is always going to exclude somebody who should not be excluding. Having universality, basically covering the whole system, and then looking at repairing equity for things like land value taxes, as he said, but also things that would address maybe even a wealth tax, although I'm not a fan of wealth tax myself, but there's things that you can do to help repair the system, helping to raise wages in certain sectors of the economy. That's what you should be doing in addition to a universal basic income to take care of all these problems. Because at the end of the day, it's not like, for example, yesterday was proposed basic incomes that could cover, for example, LGBT and trans youth. That's a great idea. The issue is that will require creating a registry, the government creating a registry of those people. I would never be comfortable with that. I don't think anybody should be comfortable with that, as we've seen today. So we need to look at how do we have a low impact benefit policy for these people, and to create a restitution system that is low impact and doesn't involve either registries or missing out on people who should not be missing out on.
We are way over, but I want to make sure that Giselle gets at least the last brief short question.
This is a technical question.
Oh, okay.
I've heard, the child tax credit, and you repeated it, Max, that these payments reduce child poverty by 42%. That's the number that I've heard. How did you arrive at that number?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we're using our software, which has a model of all the tax benefit programs in the US, pretty much, many of them in Massachusetts as well at this point. And we marry that with the current population survey, which is a government survey of households that encompasses your income, benefit receipt, kind of taxes. We can compute your taxes and benefits from this software. So you can kind of design your own policy using that. And we plugged in the Massachusetts Cambridge Cash Assistance Program into that software. So
How did we get the results so fast? I mean, while it was going on.
oh, it's a simulation. So it's sort of saying, if we did this, we're able to simulate the impact of the policy before it's implemented. We'd love to cross-check against, at some point, what happens in the real world afterwards. But this is a pretty common approach for, yeah, microeconomic simulations often used for these.
I know we're over. I just want to mention too that that we just reduced child poverty, and then we just increased child poverty by over 40%. So like, just think about that. That we had a policy that reduced child poverty, and it even reduced the amount of plasma that parents were selling. It reduced desperation, and we just let it stay. It's gone. And so, you know, there's a question of how much evidence matters, and obviously the economics question. It's like $100 billion a year to pay for child poverty. Costs us over $1 trillion a year. The ROI on eliminating child poverty is 10 to 1, and so we know all of that, and we didn't do it. Like, here we are. We just did something, and we just purposely increased child poverty. Why? I think it's all politics. It's not economics. So we really need to focus on, you know, how do we change the government system so that it responds to evidence, to people demanding things. And obviously right now that's broken. We see that which just happened today.
Absolutely. And I know we're going to keep going and talking about this after, you know, the end of this session to keep the conversation going. There will be a following afternoon plenary session, the intersectionality of movements, basic income as a tool for justice, here in the main room, followed by reflections and closing remarks to conclude the in-person programming for this year's conference. And then tomorrow, please join us for the virtual part of the conference on Crowdcast for more sessions. Please thank me in thanking our wonderful panel and for awesome discussion.